All right, let's dive in today. And today we're going to tackle a pretty interesting request about dissecting historical narratives surrounding Ottoman rule in Bulgaria.
All right.
So you sent us this source. It's called Ottoman Rule and Bulgarian History, a critical analysis.
Right.
And it lays out, I think it's safe to say, a distinctly Bulgarian nationalist perspective.
Yeah.
And you're kind of interested in seeing how that stacks up against other historical accounts, particularly when it comes to some of the claims of forced conversion and Ottoman oppression.
Yeah, it's a great question. And thankfully, we've got like a treasure trove of sources to work with here. Everything from, some in-depth historical analyses like Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire to some fascinating demographic data in Ottoman population 1830 to 1914.
Wow.
And we can even get into like how historical memory itself is constructed with Levy, civilizational mnemonics, memory studies.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's kind of just jump right into it.
Okay.
And start with one of the most, I think, contentious claims that's made in Ottoman rule and Bulgarian history.
Sure.
And that is this idea of widespread forced conversions of Bulgarians to Islam under Ottoman rule.
Okay.
The book really paints this picture of coercion and religious persecution.
Right.
But when we bring in some of these other sources, does that narrative really hold up?
It's definitely a compelling narrative.
Yeah.
But when we start bringing in these other sources, I think a much more nuanced picture kind of merges. For instance, a conversion to Islam in the Balkans, Kisve-Bahasi petitions, and Ottoman social life.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, but it's a really interesting counterpoint.
Okay.
This book digs into these Kisve-Bahasi petitions, which were basically requests that were made by new converts to Islam for rewards from the Sultan.
Interesting, okay.
And what's really fascinating is that these petitions actually highlight the converts' own motivations for conversion.
So they're saying, hey, I did this. Can I get my reward?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they weren't always about religious zeal.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about being forced into this new faith, but more about kind of like making a choice, however calculated within the existing system.
Yeah. And the reasons for conversion that are detailed in these petitions are often very practical.
Like what?
Some people hoped for social advancement.
Okay.
Some were looking for economic benefits, and some even saw it as a way to avoid certain taxes.
Wow. So you could kind of game the system a little bit.
You could.
That's really interesting.
So these petitions provide us with a glimpse into like individual agency that really challenges that simple narrative of forced conversion.
Okay.
In fact, the same source points out that conversion was often like a gradual process, like a slow trickle, rather than this mass forced event.
So it wasn't like, a door-to-door, you must convert now kind of situation. It was more like a slow...
It's kind of cultural... evolution.
Evolution, yeah. And this ties into, I think, a broader point about Ottoman rule, which Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire really highlights, and that is the level of religious tolerance that actually existed within the empire.
All right, so tell me more about that.
Okay.
Like, what did coexistence look like in practice?
So, for example, non-Muslims could obtain what were called barats from foreign powers, and these documents acted almost like diplomatic immunity.
Oh, wow.
They granted, certain protections and advantages.
So they had like a special...
They had a special status. Yeah, even a degree of legal autonomy.
Wow.
So they could engage in trade, they could practice their religion, and even maintain their own courts in some cases.
So it wasn't a completely level playing field, but there were systems in place that allowed for at least a degree of religious freedom. Yeah, exactly. And it's worth noting that the same source, Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire, points out that when it came to trade with Europe, Muslim traders were actually a very small number compared to non-Muslims.
Yeah.
So this challenges that, common perception of Ottoman rule as being, this Muslim-dominated, oppressive,
Economic,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So the picture we're getting here is far more complex than just this black and white narrative that we often see in nationalist accounts.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good reminder that history is rarely that simple.
Exactly.
But things get even more complicated and, dare I say, maybe even a little darker when we start to look at what happened after Bulgaria's so-called liberation.
Right.
So that's where I think we'll pick up the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we left off last time talking about some of those complexities of Ottoman rule in Bulgaria,
right,
and how some of the historical narratives, especially the ones presented in that source you sent, Ottoman Rule in Bulgarian History, don't always line up with the evidence we have.
Yeah, exactly like we saw with the idea of mass forced conversions.
Right.
It doesn't quite hold up when we look at those primary sources, like the Kisve-Bahasi petitions, which actually reveal a lot more like personal agency and strategic decision-making going on with those conversions to Islam.
And we also talked about how the Ottoman Empire, while not being perfect by any means, did have systems in place that allowed for a certain level of religious tolerance and coexistence between different communities.
Exactly.
But like you hinted at before the break, things took a pretty dramatic turn after Bulgaria gained its independence in the late 19th century.
Yeah, things
like the narrative flips.
They really do.
And we see the treatment of Muslims and the Turkish minority change drastically.
Yeah.
So walk me through this. Like, what happened after liberation that makes this period so complicated?
Well, as Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire explains, with the rise of nationalism across Europe, newly independent Balkan states, Bulgaria included, became kind of fixated on creating these ethnically homogenous nation states. So they engaged in what historians call demographic warfare.
Demographic warfare, wow.
Yeah, they used tactics like forced expulsions.
I know.
And even forced conversions.
Oh, so the tables had turned.
Yeah, in a
very real way.
To solidify their national identity.
So essentially the goal was to erase, or at least minimize the presence of anyone who didn't fit into this new singular Bulgarian identity.
Exactly.
And this wasn't just theoretical, right?
No.
This had real consequences.
Yeah, it had devastating consequences for a lot of communities.
Yeah.
The book gives this really poignant example with the Pomaks.
The Pomaks,
a group of Bulgarian Muslims who were actually forcefully converted to Christianity during this period.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's like the very people who had been, marginalized under Ottoman rule were now being subjected to a similar treatment, just under a different banner.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a pattern we see repeated throughout history.
Yeah.
And to really bring this home, take a look at the visual data you have there.
Okay.
Specifically, those images showing the decrease in Muslim populations in certain regions of Bulgaria after its liberation.
Wow. Yeah, these images are really striking.
Yeah, you can literally see...
That's crazy.
Yeah, those demographic shifts happening.
You can literally see it like right before your eyes.
Right before your eyes. It's powerful evidence of the human cost of these nation-building projects.
Yeah.
And this is where understanding how memory works becomes really crucial.
Right.
Levy, civilizational mnemonics, memory studies really helps unpack this.
Okay, yeah, because it's not just about what happened.
Right.
It's also about how those events are remembered and passed down for generations.
Absolutely. The book introduces this concept of civilizational mnemonics, which are basically like deeply ingrained cultural memories that shape our understanding of the past. And these memories can be incredibly powerful. They're not just individual perspectives, but entire national narratives.
So in a way, it's like these memories, even if they're distorted or incomplete, become like part of a nation's DNA.
Right.
Influencing how they see themselves, their place in the world.
Exactly. And often these narratives are like deliberately constructed and reinforced to serve specific political goals. That's what we see happening in the Bulgarian horrors culture and the international history of the Great Eastern Crisis, 1876, 1878. This book explores how, in the lead up to Bulgaria's liberation, nationalist propaganda relied heavily on these very stark binary opposition, like West versus East, Christian versus Muslim, modern versus backward.
And of course, painting the Ottomans as the other, as like the embodiment of everything backwards and oppressive, helps solidify a sense of Bulgarian unity. And justifies the struggle for independence.
Exactly.
But it also creates a very skewed view of history.
Precisely. And this kind of manipulation of history isn't unique to Bulgaria.
Right.
We see similar patterns in nationalist narratives around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings us to that really powerful quote from the Bulgarian nationalist Georgy Rakovsky, who famously said, "Oh, senseless and foolish ones, why are you ashamed to call yourselves Bulgarians?"
So what's the significance of that quote in the context of what we've been talking about?
Well, that quote, which, by the way, is highlighted in the Bulgarian Horrors, really gets at, like, the heart of the anxiety surrounding national identity at the time. Rakovsky's basically challenging his fellow Bulgarians to, like, embrace their heritage, to shed any lingering shame associated with their Ottoman past, and forge this new, distinct Bulgarian identity.
So it's about reclaiming a sense of pride and belonging.
Yeah.
But also maybe, like, distancing oneself from anything perceived as foreign or other?
Exactly. And while it's understandable that nations want to create their own narratives and identities, the danger lies in simplifying history, erasing nuance, and perpetuating these kind of, like, us versus them mentalities.
Right. Which, unfortunately, is something we see all too often.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think this is a good place to leave off for today.
Okay.
We'll wrap up our deep dive in the next part.
Well, we've spent a lot of time in this deep dive kind of unpacking some pretty complex and, frankly, challenging aspects of Bulgarian history.
Yeah, it has been a journey.
Especially as it relates to Ottoman rule and the construction of national identity.
Right. It's been fascinating, though.
Yeah, it has.
Tracing these narratives through the various sources.
From those, like, individual stories captured in those Kizve Bahasi petitions to those broader historical analyses, like Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, and those insights into memory, like from Levy, civilizational mnemonics, memory studies. And we've seen how these historical narratives, often shaped by nationalist agendas, don't always align with the full picture.
Right.
But I think the big question here is, like, why does all this matter today?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. How do these historical narratives, some dating back centuries, still impact the modern Balkans?
I mean, it's a crucial question. These aren't just, you know, dusty old stories. They have a very real impact on modern day perceptions, relationships, even political realities in the region.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I mean, those conflicts were fueled, at least in part, by these long-standing historical grievances and competing narratives of victimhood.
So essentially, those ghosts of the past were never really fully laid to rest.
Sadly, no.
Yeah.
And that's where those civilizational mnemonics that we were talking about from Levy, civilizational mnemonics memory studies, become so powerful. I mean, these deeply ingrained cultural memories, often passed down through generations, can shape entire societies' worldviews. They color perceptions of neighboring countries. They fuel prejudices and even contribute to the justification of violence.
So it's almost like these historical narratives become a lens through which people interpret current events, even if that lens is distorted or incomplete.
Exactly.
And those simplistic binary oppositions that we were discussing earlier, the us versus them mentalities that were so prevalent in the 19th century.
Yeah, as highlighted in the Bulgarian Horrors. Sadly, those still have a hold in some circles today.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
It is,
These narratives create expectations. They fuel tensions. And sometimes even lead to actions that perpetuate the very conflicts that they claim to explain.
It's a tragic cycle. And breaking free from it requires a conscious effort to, like, critically examine these narratives, to challenge assumptions, and to seek out multiple perspectives.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Like, what can you take away from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway here is, like, the importance of being aware of how these historical narratives are constructed, how they're often used to serve very specific agendas, and how they can continue to influence the present even centuries later.
Absolutely.
You know, it's about recognizing that history is complex. It rarely fits into those, like, neat little boxes that nationalist narratives tend to create.
It's about understanding that there were periods of tolerance and coexistence under Ottoman rule, just as there were periods of oppression. And that the aftermath of liberation wasn't always a triumph. It often brought its own set of challenges and injustices.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that history is like an ongoing conversation. Okay. It's not this fixed set of facts.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to engage in that conversation thoughtfully.
Absolutely.
To question what we're told.
Yeah.
And to seek out a more nuanced understanding of the past.
Because that nuanced understanding is really essential for building a more peaceful and tolerant future.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
okay,
our final thought for you is this.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to dig deeper. To challenge those accepted narratives and to seek out those hidden voices and untold stories. Because history, as they say, is often much stranger and far more interesting than we might initially believe.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And until next time, keep questioning.